The F-14 Tomcat wasn't just another Cold War fighter. It was a machine born from urgency, politics, and a missile that was supposed to change naval warfare forever. Everyone remembers it from Top Gun, but behind the Hollywood glamour lies a story of rushed deadlines, engineering miracles, and deadly flaws. At its core, the Tomcat wasn't built to chase dogfights. It was designed to stop them before they ever began. The 1960s were not kind to the U.S. Navy. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union was rolling out bombers like the Tu-22 backfire and missiles capable of outrunning almost anything in the American arsenal. The Navy didn't just want a new fighter. It needed a shield, an aircraft that could extend its reach hundreds of miles and swat down enemies long before they came near the fleet. Enter the F-111B, a joint Air Force-Navy project. On paper, it looked like the answer: long-range, heavy payload, advanced avionics. In reality, it was a disaster. Overweight, underpowered, and unable to safely land on carriers, the F-111B nearly crippled naval aviation plans. Congress killed the program in 1968, leaving the Navy scrambling. The clock was ticking because carriers needed protection, and there was nothing in service that could provide it. Grumman Aerospace stepped in with a radical design that could meet the urgent demand while salvaging lessons from the failed interceptor. In just 22 months, the F-14 Tomcat was born. With variable geometry wings, twin tails, and room for 6 giant Phoenix missiles, the Tomcat wasn't conceived as a nimble dogfighter. It was a fleet defender, plain and simple. Every line of its design screamed interceptor. Ironically, the very aircraft meant to prevent close combat would eventually become one of the most feared dogfighters in naval aviation history, thanks to pilots who learned to use its bulk and agility in ways its designers never imagined. The Tomcat, from the beginning, was proof that necessity could force engineering brilliance out of chaos. At the center of the Tomcat's existence was one missile, the AIM-54 Phoenix. Stretching 13 feet long and tipping the scales at over 1,000 pounds, it wasn't just another air-to-air missile, it was a game-changer, at least on paper. Paired with the F-14's AN or AWG-9 radar, the Phoenix could track multiple targets and strike them from over 100 miles away, flying at speeds beyond Mach 5. For the Navy, this meant the Tomcat could theoretically obliterate an incoming wave of Soviet bombers before they even saw the carrier group. It was fire-and-forget technology decades ahead of its time. But here's the twist. In over 30 years of U.S. Navy service, the Phoenix was never fired in combat. The reason was as much practical as it was strategic. The sheer size of the missiles limited how many could be carried without crippling the aircraft's performance. Landing back on a carrier with a full load was unsafe, so a Tomcat either had to fire them all or dump them into the sea before recovery, a laughably expensive prospect. Add to that the Cold War never erupting into full-scale naval combat, and the Phoenix became more of a deterrent than an actual weapon. The only nation to truly unleash the Phoenix was Iran during its brutal war with Iraq, where it became both feared and legendary. For the U.S., however, the missile remained a symbol of what if. The Tomcat was built around the Phoenix, its engines spaced apart to fit 4 under the fuselage and 2 more beneath the wings. Yet this defining feature never fulfilled its original purpose. It's one of aviation's great ironies. The Tomcat's most iconic weapon was also its least used. What made the F-14 stand out wasn't just its sleek silhouette or Hollywood fame, it was the wings. Grumman's engineers equipped the Tomcat with variable geometry wings, allowing the jet to adapt its aerodynamics in flight. At low speeds, the wings swept forward to 20 degrees, maximizing lift for carrier takeoffs and landings. At supersonic speeds, they swung back to 68 degrees, slicing through the air with minimal drag. This gave the Tomcat flexibility few fighters could match, combining fleet defense endurance with high-speed pursuit capability. But the wings weren't the only trick. Because nothing could be mounted on their moving parts, engineers had to get creative about missile placement. 4 Phoenix missiles were crammed under the fuselage, requiring the engines to be spaced an unusual 9 feet apart. This wide separation wasn't just structural. It transformed the fuselage into a lifting body, providing up to 60% of the aircraft's total lift. That's why, in one famous 1991 incident, an F-14 was able to land safely after losing half of one wing in a mid-air collision. The fuselage itself kept the aircraft airborne. The wing system also introduced the first aviation microprocessor, automatically adjusting sweep angles to optimize performance. Pilots could override it, but the system freed them to focus on combat instead of wing angles. Even when parked on crowded carrier decks, the Tomcat had a trick, oversweeping its wings to 75 degrees so more aircraft could fit in line. It was practical, smart, and iconic, shaping the jet's legendary profile. Yet, with innovation came headaches. The complexity demanded staggering maintenance, sometimes 40 to 60 hours of ground crew work for every single flight hour. Still, for all its quirks, the Tomcat's variable geometry made it one of the most versatile fighters ever built. For all its glamour, the Tomcat had a dark side, its engines. When the F-14 first rolled out, the Pratt & Whitney TF-30S were already outdated. Designed for bombers, not nimble fighters, they had no business powering an aircraft expected to outmaneuver MiGs at sea. The Navy knew it, but with the F-11-1B canceled, there was no time to wait for new engines. So, the TF-30SEs were shoved into the Tomcat. The results were catastrophic. Compressor stalls became an everyday nightmare. A sudden throttle movement, a sharp turn, even a carrier landing, any of these could cause one engine to lose power. That might have been manageable in a twin-engine fighter, but the Tomcat's engines were mounted far apart. If one died, the imbalance of thrust could spin the aircraft out of control, sometimes into a dreaded flat spin. Recovery training didn't exist at first, so most crews had only one option: eject. Hollywood immortalized this in Top Gun with Goose's death. Sadly, it wasn't fiction. Ejecting from a flat spin carried its own dangers, as the canopy could linger in the turbulence overhead, sometimes with fatal results. Over 28% of F-14 crashes were linked to engine failures, an astonishing figure for a frontline U.S. fighter. Relief finally came with the F-14B and D models, which introduced General Electric's F-110 engines. Suddenly, the Tomcat became the fighter it was meant to be. Powerful, reliable, with a thrust-to-weight ratio approaching 1-to-1, it could now launch from carriers without afterburners, fly farther, and climb faster. But for much of its career, the Tomcat was like a sports car with faulty brakes, stunning to look at, terrifying to drive. The engines were its Achilles heel, a flaw that nearly overshadowed the brilliance of its design. Although the Tomcat was designed around the Phoenix missile, it wasn't a one-trick pony. Beneath its fuselage and wings, the F-14 could carry a deadly mix of AIM-7 Sparrows for medium-range engagements and AIM-9 Sidewinders for close combat. This flexibility ensured it could adapt to whatever threat the fleet faced. But one addition stood out: a gun. The Navy insisted the Tomcat mount an M61 Vulcan cannon after the F-4 Phantom debacle in Vietnam, where pilots complained bitterly about going Winchester, running out of missiles with no backup weapon. The Vulcan was a beast, a 6-barrel, 20mm Gatling-style gun capable of spitting 6,000 rounds per minute. Yet, the Tomcat only carried 676 rounds. Do the math, and that meant barely 6 seconds of continuous fire. Pilots needed discipline to conserve ammo in the heat of a dogfight. That's where one clever trick came in. Ground crews sometimes loaded the belts with deliberate gaps every 50 rounds, forcing the gun to pause after each burst. This simple hack turned the Vulcan into a precise tool rather than a fire hose, letting pilots control their shots with deadly efficiency. Even more impressive, the Tomcat was engineered to hold onto its spent casings rather than ejecting them, to protect its engines from ingesting debris during flight. Every detail mattered because the stakes were sky high when you were the last line of defense for an entire carrier group. Together, these weapons gave the Tomcat teeth at every range: long-distance strikes with Phoenix, mid-range attacks with Sparrows, knife fights with Sidewinders, and last-ditch salvos with the Vulcan. While the Phoenix never proved itself in U.S. combat, the Tomcat's other weapons did, making it a versatile predator rather than just a lumbering missile truck. Ironically, the only country that truly tested the F-14 in combat wasn't the United States. It was Iran. In the 1970s, before the Islamic Revolution, the Shah purchased 80 Tomcats along with hundreds of Phoenix missiles. When war erupted with Iraq in 1980, those jets became Iran's most prized assets. Despite sanctions and dwindling spare parts, Iranian pilots used them to devastating effect against Saddam Hussein's Soviet-supplied MiGs. The most legendary story came when an Iranian pilot fired a single Phoenix missile into a formation of Iraqi MiG-23s. The explosion downed 3 aircraft at once, a kill ratio unheard of in modern air combat. Across the 8-year war, Iran claimed between 130 and 150 air-to-air kills with the Tomcat, cementing its reputation as a predator of the skies. What's astonishing is that Iran still flies Tomcats today, despite being cut off from U.S. support since 1979. Estimates suggest around 30 remain airworthy, maintained through cannibalization, smuggling, and reverse engineering. Some upgrades have even been rumored, incorporating Russian technology and homegrown modifications. In a twist of Cold War irony, the Tomcat, built to fight the Soviets, has outlived its service in the U.S. Navy and now patrols the skies of Iran. For the United States, the Tomcat's combat record was modest, limited to a few encounters over Libya in the 1980s and strikes in Iraq during the 1990s. But in Iran, the aircraft became legendary, its Phoenix missiles proving their worth in battle after all. The legacy of the Tomcat, therefore, belongs as much to Tehran as to Washington, making it one of the strangest international stories in aviation history. By 2006, the F-14's time had come to an end. Expensive to maintain, often requiring 40 to 60 man-hours for every flight hour, the Tomcat was a logistical nightmare. The Navy transitioned to the F-18 Super Hornet, a cheaper, more versatile aircraft. But retiring the Tomcat wasn't as simple as parking them in a desert boneyard. There was one major problem: Iran. Since Iran still operated F-14s, every spare part was a potential lifeline to keep their fleet airborne. To prevent pieces from being smuggled overseas, the U.S. ordered nearly all retired Tomcats shredded, not stored. Watching these iconic jets torn apart was painful for enthusiasts and veterans alike, but it was considered necessary for national security. In one bizarre case, 2 derelict Tomcats meant for destruction were discovered abandoned in a Texas field years later, a reminder of how far-reaching their story had become. Culturally, however, the Tomcat never died. Top Gun immortalized it as the ultimate symbol of speed, freedom, and naval aviation cool. Its swing wings, growling engines, and imposing stance became pop culture icons. Yet the most ironic part of its story remains. The missile that defined it, the Phoenix, was never used in combat by the United States. Instead, the Tomcat is remembered as both an engineering marvel and a cautionary tale. It was fast, powerful, and innovative, but also temperamental and costly. Still, its silhouette remains instantly recognizable, and its legend, reinforced by both Hollywood and history, continues to inspire aviation fans worldwide. The Tomcat may be gone from American decks, but it lives on as one of the most iconic fighters ever built for a war it never truly fought. The F-14 Tomcat was a paradox from start to finish. Born out of a canceled project, engineered around a missile that the U.S. Navy never actually fired in combat, and plagued for years by engines that threatened its own pilots, it still became one of the most iconic fighters in history. Its variable wings, radar power, and cinematic fame in Top Gun made it unforgettable, even as its real-world record remained limited. Iran carried the Tomcat into true battle, while the U.S. chose to dismantle nearly every one of its retired airframes, shredding them to prevent parts from slipping overseas. Yet no amount of destruction could erase its legend. The Tomcat endures as a symbol of Cold War ambition, technological daring, and aviation's strange ironies, an aircraft designed to fight a war that never came and remembered forever as a star.